AFL Grand Finals, of course, have a legacy-creating history, whether it's Brisbane finally getting over the hump this year, or, of course, where it all started for the VFL in 1897 when Essendon beat Melbourne by a goal in a 1-goal 8-8 behind game. Yeah, crazy town. But what about the Grand Final matchups we never got? And that's the theme of this video. I've got 8 Grand Finals that could have happened, maybe should have happened, and would have been really exciting to see. And with a couple of them even replacing really good Grand Finals. So it's not to say that these are going to be infinitely better, but the storylines behind them maybe going in would have been absolutely epic. It's a fun exercise, guys. There's 2 rules, though. One is that at least one team that made the grand final that year had to stay, so I couldn't kick both of them out. The second one being that those teams couldn't have played a final against each other in the same year. Think of 22 with Geelong versus Collingwood. They played in a 12-point game in that first qualifying final, so saying that it would have been the better matchup than Geelong versus Sydney, whilst that may be true, would still break the rule here, and it would make this list infinitely long. I wanted this to be really fun and a little bit of a challenge as well, but I've got a list of 8. We're going to go in reverse chronological order. Let's do this. 2023, Carlton versus Collingwood. Yes, the 2023 Grand Final was an absolute thriller, one of the best in modern times. And when you think of between 1989 and 2009, we only had 3 Grand Finals that were decided by under 5 goals, and only one of them decided by single digits. 23 being an absolute corker would have been amazing. What would have happened, though, with the Carlton-Collingwood Grand Final is Melbourne would have exploded, I believe. And I tell you, this town would have been as divided as Twitter thinks Australia actually is. I mean, for crying out loud, guys, all we want is a better, cheaper, and easier way of surviving in this world. And yes, we are going to disagree on how that can happen. But for crying out loud, the amount of hatred that people think is in the world is remarkable. The far left and the far right are as fucking stupid as each other. But moving on from politics, let's go back to the sporting point of view. You would have had Carlton fans hating Collingwood, obviously. Collingwood fans hating Carlton, obviously. They already do that. You would have had neutrals that would have hoped for the game to just be an infinite draw and neither team win, or you would have had neutrals that would have admitted a little bit in their heart that they were 1% barracking for one of these two sides. Would have been sick. And in the fact that Collingwood kicked Carlton out of the finals in 22 and just, my God. 2019, Richmond versus Collingwood. Yeah, they played in the prelim the year before, I know that. But one of the big criticisms, I suppose, of the Hawthorn and Richmond dynasties is that 5 of those 6 grand finals were played against interstate teams, with, of course, the only Victorian grand final of the 6, Richmond-Geelong, not being at the MCG anyway, for better or for worse, of course, during the COVID season of 2020. Richmond, Collingwood, of course, haven't played in a grand final in yonks. 1980 would have been the last time that those two teams played against each other. Would have just been really epic to see the Mason Cox storyline. Would he have dominated that game again? Was it a fluke, flash in the pan? Who knows? Yes, we will never know. I understand that. The 2019 grand final, though, was, let's be honest, a bit shit. So this just would have been better. 2015, Fremantle versus West Coast. Nat Fyfe broke his leg. Now, this game, I think, more than any other, is kind of where free kick Hawthorn should have been directed, but it wasn't, because the Hawks' first 2 goals in this game were genuinely crap umpiring decisions, and you could argue that gave them momentum, and no, I will not concede that free kick Hawthorn was a league rigging thing, right? Circa the Kansas City Chiefs right now in the NFL. A Derby grand final, guys. Like, need I say more? We haven't had a showdown grand final. We haven't had a Derby grand final. We haven't had, obviously, a Battle of the Bridge grand final. And 2015 arguably is the year that those teams have been the best simultaneously. I can acknowledge, taking the Hawthorn part out of me, is I think neutrals were kind of robbed here, I'm not going to lie. Taylor Dorea, though, has never played a better game of footy than that 2015 prelim. Holy crap, he was good. 2005, Sydney versus Adelaide. I have said this before, I will say it again. I will say it until the day I die. The 2005 grand final is the closest crap game of football I have ever seen. The game's awful. Now, here's where I've got to give a lot of credit to the Swans. That was the only way they were going to win the game, by the way. Right? We saw that the next year. West Coast kicked over 80, and the Swans, yes, I know, fell by a point. I understand that, but couldn't get there. Restricting that Eagles list was the only way they were going to get it done. They couldn't win in a shootout, even a semi-shootout in 2005 terms. However, the Crows had actually beaten the Swans in their own game in that regard, because they had won by 7 points at home, admittedly, not too long before the final started. Yes, I understand that the Eagles did beat the Swans in a qualifying final, but you could argue that the Swans were able to get their revenge. The Crows weren't. They faltered in the finals, but the Crows averaged 82 points a game in the final series. The Eagles averaged 72 and the Swans 68. Ironic, yes, that West Coast outscored Sydney on average by 4 points. Sydney won by 4 points in the grand final. But Adelaide offensively, although they didn't score as many points as West Coast did, they were just an offensive juggernaut. I do think, though, that being 17-5, the same as the Eagles, having a better defensive unit at that point, I genuinely think Adelaide would have been a better chance in that game. I really do. And also, it would eliminate the 05 grand final from human history, which deserves to happen because it's a viewing spectacle. And yes, the Leo Barry moment is iconic. The other 119 and a half minutes is not. 1999, North Melbourne versus Essendon. Carlton fans, do not hate me. Cooter's last quarter in that game is arguably one of the best quarters of all time, especially with me being alive. I lump that in with Nick Davis in the 2005 semi-final. I lump that in with Scotty Lucas's 7 1/4. Those kind of performances, I should say, remarkable game of footy, and Carlton deserved the win. That's not what this video is about. However, with the marshmallow comments with Sheedy and Dennis Pagan there, North and Essendon's rivalry throughout the 90s, I think footy fans kind of deserved this one. They really did. And of course, I kind of enjoy the story that John Elliott tells in his open mic, which is when he was campaigning in the opposition's territory, the Labor territory at the time. Fans were telling him that he was going to win the election, they were going to lose the footy. Well, Carlton won the footy and Liberal lost the election. So there you go. But yeah, this just would have been epic to see, but I do feel a little uncomfortable trying to erase Cooter's last quarter from footy history, if that makes you feel any better. 1995, Carlton versus West Coast. I genuinely believe that there are not many grand finals in the 90s, genuinely, where the two best sides played against each other. Because think about it, who were the best teams of the 90s? You would argue West Coast, you would argue North, you would argue Adelaide if you want to lump in those two flags there, which is the exact same amount as West Coast and North won during that decade. That's fine. The Adelaide-North Melbourne played off in 98, Daz. What are you saying here? Well, I would argue that from an individualistic season standpoint, no one can touch Carlton in 95 throughout the 90s as a single season team. And unfortunately, we were not able to get one of those dynasty teams to take them on, if you want to call it a dynasty, or one of those multi-premiership teams to take them on. The big reason here why I've chosen West Coast to be that side is because about a month before the final started, they played against each other, and it was a 1-point game. So if we could have gotten something close to that instead of all the crap grand finals in the 90s we got, that would have been good. Because the 1992 grand final was the closest 90s grand final, and that was decided by 28 points, 26 points, something like that. So, yeah, this would have been better. The team that had won 2 of the last 3 flags going into it against one of the most dominant single-season teams of all time. Sign me up. 1986, Carlton versus Fitzroy. The David Parkin and Robert Walls storylines here would have been insane. Walls was at Fitzroy and then went to Carlton. Of course, they would go on and lose the 86 grand final, but win the 87 grand final to go 1-1 against the Hawks during that period. Of course, David Rees-Jones, what he did to Dermy on that day in shutting him down was elite. And that Carlton era in the 80s, whilst, yes, didn't have, the success of the Hawks, 83, 86, 88, 89, but for crying out loud, this team won 3 flags and kind of got shunted, right, compared to, I think, the Hawthorn team of that era, maybe because the Hawks also got 91, and then I look at it and go, but Carlton won in 79 as well. Why does that get ignored? Different story for a different day, but Fitzroy, Robert Wall said in his open mic that Fitzroy just didn't allow you success from finances, I should say. Geez, I'm having a stroke over here, and David Parkin nearly proved him inexplicably wrong. You've got the amazing final against the Bombers in which they won by a point. They kicked the first 2 goals against Hawthorn in that second semi and got blown off the park, unfortunately. But for the Walls v Parkin thing, Fitzroy making a flag, if they had have got there and won, would they have even merged to become the Brisbane Lions? Who knows? But that's a tasty hypothetical in Dazzling, let me tell you. And last but not least, Richmond versus North, 19 1980. North in the 70s, of course, one of the most dominant teams. They got their 1975 and 1977 flags. They also, of course, played Richmond in 74, Hawthorn in 76 and 78. So they were, of course, the dominant team of that time. Didn't quite get there in 1980. To be honest, Richmond Collingwood, that 1980 grand final is not low key. It's just garbage, to be perfectly honest. Yes, Kevin Bartlett puts on an absolute clinic. That's always fun to watch if you're a Richmond fan and you go back to it. But also, again, kind of like a couple of lineups in this video, they played off just before the finals in a relatively close game. It was under 3 goals. So it just would have made for a much better spectacle. And to be honest, I just didn't want to do 7 grand finals. So there you go. 8 grand final matchups that we probably should have got, maybe deserved, but unfortunately couldn't get. A couple of these grand finals were really epic, but I thought this would be a fun video to do. If you agree, if you could click that like button so more people can see the video, help me out with the YouTube algorithm, I would really appreciate that. Subscribe to join the Daz Talks Footy family. I hope you, my friends, have the best weekend of your life. There's going to be 2 videos next week, one being assisted on by one of the best footy brains that I know, and I know you're going to be pumped for that. So, if you haven't already, go and watch my previous video, which is about how to fix the Brownlow medal. I'm really proud of that video. YouTube is not. So if you could help me out there, that would be fantastic. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and I'll see you in the next one.